Aha! This is Laborz, and these are the paints I used in the making of this video. I want to use the fake oil wash technique on the explosion under the character, but first I need to cover the smoke. I use my brush and cover the areas that are close to the parts of the character with the base layer consistency. I do that to minimize the overspraying with the airbrush. If you want to, you can use a masking putty, but I think it's way faster this way. I go around the legs and I angle my brush to reach these areas without staining the already painted parts. If you make a mistake here, I slap on your tiny hand, so try to be precise just like when you are cutting granny's toenails. Next, I use a 0.50mm airbrush to create a more organic gradient over the smoke rather than using a base layer consistency with the brush over the whole surface. I'm aiming for full coverage over the inner parts of the smoke, and I try to add less layers to the parts that sticking out the most, because usually a dense smoke around explosions are almost black. This grey-brown is on the warmer spectrum of greys, so it can indicate the heat coming from the smoke. It's time to add some color to the grey and create heat points in the smoke. The smoke that is sculpted on the base is only top part of a bigger explosion, or I assume it is, so the lower half should be the warmer side of it. Now the problem is we can't really paint just the lower half and leave the upper section darker, because it will create a colored smoke effect that has a gradient. That won't look like an explosion. I'm checking where the sculpt has the deepest and innermost sections and aiming there with my brush, leaving some of the grey visible around those parts. I build up the opacity with a few layers and I go around all the base to create a centric feel to it. If you happen to give a bigger burst here and there with your brush, don't worry about it, because this time it's actually going to look good if you flood the recess areas. The main thing to look out for is not getting rid of the grey parts, because if you do, 1, I will slap on your tiny hand, and 2, it will look like the whole base is on a fire rather than an explosion. Now it's time for our fake oil wash. So I'm using water between the bristles of my brush, and I put some water into the center crevices inside my Wild Rider red areas. I do that over a small section, and you can see the shiny parts of the base where I pulled up some of the water. After that, I use a thin layer consistency of ice yellow and dip the brush into those small pools of water. The surface tension of the water is basically pulling the paint out of the bristles and spread it as far as the water went in the crevices. I make multiple runs of that, so I have a nice value sketch that I can use in the upcoming step. This mini I'm painting is a board game quality miniature and don't have the crispiest crevices, but even so you can see how nicely the paint flows into the recess areas where I had water. Also, you can increase the opacity of the paint with multiple layers or using a thicker consistency, and you can use this technique as a black lining tool over any armor panel. Only use a black paint for that, or any color of your choice really. It's called a fake oil wash because it behaves very similarly to oil washes, where you just dip the paint into the recess area and the oil paint miraculously knows where to go. So give it a try if you will, and leave a comment how it turned out. Since I have this nice value inside the smoke now, it's time to add some more heat to it with Fire Dragon Bright. I aim for the off-white parts and I apply small bursts with the airbrush. Oranges usually have poor coverage, so the airbrush can help you with speeding up that process a lot. Be patient at this point, and if you are not sure if the paint is coming from the nozzle, just spray some over your painting handle or the edge of the mini's base to see how well it covers. The paint is very translucent, so to prevent webbing, use very small bursts of paint and air to dry the paint fast, so you won't flood the mini. If the paint is coming up from the airbrush in a dusty finish, increase the air pressure, and if it's webbing, no matter what you do, then lower the air pressure. If that won't help, add more paint. If your airbrush is now clogged and you are hopeless, sign up for online coaching with Papa Laborts on Patreon. If you don't have an airbrush, use thin layers to build up the opacity of the paint. And it's going to take you a bit more time, but you can use that time to order an airbrush and a compressor with a hose. I add the red hue to the smoke with Evil Sun Scarlet. The placement of this red is very important. We don't want to mute back the orange areas, so I aim this red over the darker grey parts of the smoke. Since I got rid of most of the Wild Rider red with the airbrushing, I reintroduced the red hue over the smoke, making it visually more interesting with the saturated tone. The other thing I do is I transfer some of the light coming from the explosion over the lower side of the legs. I should do it on the wings too, but to be honest, the wings are casting so hard of a shadow, this red wouldn't be visible no matter how many layers I would do. So I cover the side of the thighs and the shin. The suit looks pretty reflective on the character card, so I guess the black parts should reflect some of the light coming from the explosion. To create the hottest parts of the explosion, I use one more round of the fake oil wash, placing water into the most inner parts of the orange recess areas and reduce my highlight areas, leaving most of the orange to show through. If you feel like you had too much paint over an area, just rinse off your brush and soak up the paint with a little bit of damp brush. If you have too much water, just wipe your brush on a paper towel a couple of times and soak up the water. Don't just sit there waiting for the water to dry like Granny wait for me to take her to the park, because I already told her that's not going to happen. So that's about it for the fake oil wash. Just some water and the regular acrylics and you can do some very decent panel lining. Of course, if you want to use oil paints on the surface of the Mini for their wet blending qualities, this is not going to replace that, but for some recess highlights and the black lining, this will work just as fine as any other product. And there you go guys, the Mini is done and ready for the table. If you want to see the full-length video where I paint the whole Mini, consider joining my Patreon page like these lovely people. You can find more Marvel Zombies or Massive Darkness 2 guides next to some other exclusive content. And a special shout out goes to Cold-Blooded Don, Trying to Paint Minis, Jonathan Mosner, Glitchy McCrash, Panaman45, Michael Kerr, and Ramlo. I hope your day will be as smooth as a granny's butt cheek.